fumed Gavroche. So you're going to have a bout with the bobbies? You can't tell, replied Montparnasse with an indifferent air. It's always a good thing to have a pin about one. Gavroche persisted. What are you up to tonight? Again Montparnasse took a grave tone, and said, mouthing every syllable. Things. And abruptly changing the conversation. By the way. What? Something happened t'other day. Fancy. I meet a bourgeois. He makes me a present of a sermon and his purse. I put it in my pocket. A minute later, I feel in my pocket. There's nothing there. Except the sermon, said Gavroche. But you, went on Montparnasse, where are you bound for now? Gavroche pointed to his two protégés, and said, I'm going to put these infants to bed. Whereabouts is the bed? At my house. Where's your house? At my house. So you have a lodging? Yes, I have. And where is your lodging? In the Elephant, said Gavroche. Montparnasse, though not naturally inclined to astonishment, could not restrain an exclamation. In the Elephant. Well, yes, in the Elephant, retorted Gavroche. Kekar. This is another word of the language which no one writes, and which everyone speaks. Kekar signifies KQ say Q seller. Opening square bracket. What's the matter with that? Closing square bracket. The urchin's profound remark recalled Montparnasse to calmness and good sense. He appeared to return to better sentiments with regard to Gavroche's lodging. Of course, said he, yes, the Elephant. Is it comfortable there? Very, said Gavroche. It's really bully there. There ain't any drafts, as there are under the bridges. How do you get in? Oh, I get in. So there is a hole? Demanded Montparnasse. Parbleu. I should say so. But you mustn't tell. It's between the four legs. The bobbies haven't seen it. And you climb up. Yes, I understand. A turn of the hand, crick, crack, and it's all over, no one there. After a pause, Gavroche added, I shall have a ladder for these children. Montparnasse burst out laughing. Where the devil did you pick up those young uns? Gavroche replied with great simplicity. They are some brats that a wig-maker made me a present of. Meanwhile, Montparnasse had fallen to thinking. You recognized me very readily, he muttered. He took from his pocket two small objects which were nothing more than two quills wrapped in cotton, and thrust one up each of his nostrils. This gave him a different nose. That changes you, remarked Gavroche. You're less homely so. You ought to keep them on all the time. Montparnasse was a handsome fellow, but Gavroche was a tease. Seriously, demanded Montparnasse, how do you like me so? The sound of his voice was different also. In a twinkling, Montparnasse had become unrecognizable. Oh, do play Porrichinelle for us, exclaimed Gavroche. The two children, who had not been listening up to this point, being occupied themselves in thrusting their fingers up their noses, drew near at this name, and stared at Montparnasse with dawning joy and admiration. Unfortunately, Montparnasse was troubled. He laid his hand on Gavroche's shoulder, and said to him, emphasizing his words, Listen to what I tell you, boy. If I were on the square with my dog, my knife, and my wife, and if you were to squander 10 sous on me, I wouldn't refuse to work, but this isn't Shrove Tuesday. This odd phrase produced a singular effect on the gamin. He wheeled round hastily, darted his little sparkling eyes about him with profound attention, and perceived a police sergeant standing with his back to them a few paces off. Gavroche allowed in, "Ah, good," to escape him, but immediately suppressed it, and shaking Montparnasse's hand. "Well, good evening," said he. "I'm going off to my elephant with my brats. Supposing that you should need me some night, you can come and hunt me up there. I lodge on the entresol. There is no porter. You will inquire for Monsieur Gavroche." "Very good," said Montparnasse. And they parted, Montparnasse betaking himself in the direction of the Grève, and Gavroche towards the Bastille. The little one of 5, dragged along by his brother who was dragged by Gavroche, turned his head back several times to watch Porrichinelle as he went. The ambiguous phrase by means of which Montparnasse had warned Gavroche of the presence of the policeman contained no other talisman than the assonance dig repeated 5 or 6 times in different forms. This syllable, dig, uttered alone or artistically mingled with the words of a phrase, means, "Take care, we can no longer talk freely." There was besides, in Montparnasse's sentence, a literary beauty which was lost upon Gavroche. That is morn dog, ma dag et ma dig, a slang expression of the temple, which signifies my dog, my knife, and my wife, greatly in vogue among clowns and the red tails in the great century when Molière wrote and Calat drew. 20 years ago, there was still to be seen in the southwest corner of the Place de la Bastille, near the basin of the canal, excavated in the ancient ditch of the fortress prison, a singular monument, which has already been effaced from the memories of Parisians, and which deserved to leave some trace, for it was the idea of a member of the Institute, the General-in-Chief of the Army of Egypt. We say monument, although it was only a rough model. But this model itself, a marvelous sketch, the grandiose skeleton of an idea of Napoleon's, which successive gusts of wind have carried away and thrown, on each occasion, still further from us, had become historical and had acquired a certain definiteness which contrasted with its provisional aspect. It was an elephant 40 feet high, constructed of timber and masonry, bearing on its back a tower which resembled a house, formerly painted green by some dauber, and now painted black by heaven, the wind, and time. In this deserted and unprotected corner of the place, the broad brow of the colossus, his trunk, his tusks, his tower, his enormous crupper, his forefeet, like columns produced, at night, under the starry heavens, a surprising and terrible form. It was a sort of symbol of popular force. It was somber, mysterious, and immense. It was some mighty, visible phantom, one knew not what, standing erect beside the invisible spectre of the Bastille. Few strangers visited this edifice, no passer-by looked at it. It was falling into ruins. Every season the plaster which detached itself from its sides formed hideous wounds upon it. The Aediles, as the expression ran in elegant dialect, had forgotten it ever since 1814. There it stood in its corner, melancholy, sick, crumbling, surrounded by a rotten palisade, soiled continually by drunken coachmen. Cracks meandered athwart its belly, a lath projected from its tail, tall grass flourished between its legs. And, as the level of the place had been rising all around it for a space of 30 years, by that slow and continuous movement which insensibly elevates the soil of large towns, it stood in a hollow, and it looked as though the ground were giving way beneath it. It was unclean, despised, repulsive, and superb, ugly in the eyes of the bourgeois, melancholy in the eyes of the thinker. There was something about it of the dirt which is on the point of being swept out, and something of the majesty which is on the point of being decapitated. As we have said, at night, its aspect changed. Night is the real element of everything that is dark. As soon as twilight descended, the old elephant became transfigured. He assumed a tranquil and redoubtable appearance in the formidable serenity of the shadows. Being of the past, he belonged to night. And obscurity was in keeping with his grandeur. This rough, squat, heavy, hard, austere, almost misshapen, but assuredly majestic monument, stamped with a sort of magnificent and savage gravity, has disappeared, and left to reign in peace, a sort of gigantic stove, ornamented with its pipe, which has replaced the somber fortress with its 9 towers, very much as the bourgeoisie replaces the feudal classes. It is quite natural that a stove should be the symbol of an epoch in which a pot contains power. This epoch will pass away. People have already begun to understand that, if there can be force in a boiler, there can be no force except in the brain. In other words, that which leads and drags on the world is not locomotives, but ideas. Harness locomotives to ideas, that is well done. But do not mistake the horse for the rider. At all events, to return to the Place de la Bastille, the architect of this elephant succeeded in making a grand thing out of plaster. The architect of the stove has succeeded in making a pretty thing out of bronze. This stovepipe, which has been baptized by a sonorous name, and called the Column of July, this monument of a revolution that miscarried, was still enveloped in 1832, in an immense shirt of woodwork, which we regret, for our part, and by a vast plank enclosure, which completed the task of isolating the elephant. It was towards this corner of the place, dimly lighted by the reflection of a distant street lamp, that the gamin guided his 2 brats. The reader must permit us to interrupt ourselves here and to remind him that we are dealing with simple reality, and that 20 years ago, the tribunals were called upon to judge, under the charge of vagabondage and mutilation of a public monument, a child who had been caught asleep in this very elephant of the Bastille. This fact noted, we proceed. On arriving in the vicinity of the Colossus, Gavroche comprehended the effect which the infinitely great might produce on the infinitely small, and said, "Don't be scared, infants." Then he entered through a gap in the fence into the elephant's enclosure and helped the young ones to clamber through the breach. The 2 children, somewhat frightened, followed Gavroche without uttering a word, and confided themselves to this little providence in rags which had given them bread and had promised them a shelter. There, extended along the fence, lay a ladder which by day served the laborers in the neighboring timber yard. Gavroche raised it with remarkable vigor, and placed it against one of the elephant's forelegs. Near the point where the ladder ended, a sort of black hole in the belly of the Colossus could be distinguished. Gavroche pointed out the ladder and the hole to his guests, and said to them, "Climb up and go in." The 2 little boys exchanged terrified glances. "You're afraid, brats," exclaimed Gavroche. And he added, "You shall see." He clasped the rough leg of the elephant, and in a twinkling, without deigning to make use of the ladder, he had reached the aperture. He entered it as an adder slips through a crevice, and disappeared within, and an instant later, the 2 children saw his head, which looked pale, appear vaguely, on the edge of the shadowy hole, like a wan and whitish spectre. "Well," he exclaimed, "climb up, young uns. You'll see how snug it is here. Come up, you," he said to the elder, "I'll lend you a hand." The little fellows nudged each other. The gamin frightened and inspired them with confidence at one and the same time, and then, it was raining very hard. The elder one undertook the risk. The younger, on seeing his brother climbing up, and himself left alone between the paws of this huge beast, felt greatly inclined to cry, but he did not dare. The elder lad climbed, with uncertain steps, up the rungs of the ladder. Gavroche, in the meanwhile, encouraging him with exclamations like a fencing master to his pupils, or a muleteer to his mules. "Don't be afraid. That's it. Come on. Put your feet there. Give us your hand here. Boldly. And when the child was within reach, he seized him suddenly and vigorously by the arm, and pulled him towards him. "Nabbed," said he. The brat had passed through the crack. "Now," said Gavroche, "wait for me. Be so good as to take a seat, monsieur." And making his way out of the hole as he had entered it, he slipped down the elephant's leg with the agility of a monkey, landed on his feet in the grass, grasped the child of 5 round the body, and planted him fairly in the middle of the ladder. Then he began to climb up behind him, shouting to the elder, "I'm going to boost him. Do you tug?" And in another instant, the small lad was pushed, dragged, pulled, thrust, stuffed into the hole, before he had time to recover himself, and Gavroche, entering behind him, and repulsing the ladder with a kick which sent it flat on the grass, began to clap his hands and to cry, "Here we are! Long live General Lafayette!" This explosion over, he added, "Now, young uns, you are in my house." Gavroche was at home, in fact. Oh, unforeseen utility of the useless! Charity of great things! Goodness of giants! This huge monument, which had embodied an idea of the emperor's, had become the box of a street urchin. The brat had been accepted and sheltered by the colossus. The bourgeois decked out in their Sunday finery, who passed the elephant of the Bastille, were fond of saying as they scanned it disdainfully with their prominent eyes, "What's the good of that? It served to save from the cold, the frost, the hail, and rain, to shelter from the winds of winter, to preserve from slumber in the mud which produces fever, and from slumber in the snow which produces death, a little being who had no father, no mother, no bread, no clothes, no refuge. It served to receive the innocent whom society repulsed. It served to diminish public crime. It was a lair open to one against whom all doors were shut. It seemed as though the miserable old mastodon, invaded by vermin and oblivion, covered with warts, with mold, and ulcers, tottering, worm-eaten, abandoned, condemned, a sort of mendicant colossus, asking alms in vain with a benevolent look in the midst of the crossroads, had taken pity on that other mendicant, the poor pygmy, who roamed without shoes to his feet, without a roof over his head, blowing on his fingers, clad in rags, fed on rejected scraps. That was what the elephant of the Bastille was good for. This idea of Napoleon, disdained by men, had been taken back by God. That which had been merely illustrious, had become august. In order to realize his thought, the emperor should have had porphyry, brass, iron, gold, marble. The old collection of planks, beams and plaster sufficed for God. The emperor had had the dream of a genius. In that titanic elephant, armed, prodigious, with trunk uplifted, bearing its tower and scattering on all sides its merry and vivifying waters, he wished to incarnate the people. God had done a grander thing with it, he had lodged a child there. The hole through which Gavroche had entered was a breach which was hardly visible from the outside. Being concealed, as we have stated, beneath the elephant's belly, and so narrow that it was only cats and homeless children who could pass through it. "Let's begin," said Gavroche, "by telling the porter that we are not at home." And plunging into the darkness with the assurance of a person who is well acquainted with his apartments, he took a plank and stopped up the aperture. Again Gavroche plunged into the obscurity. The children heard the crackling of the match thrust into the phosphoric bottle. The chemical match was not yet in existence. At that epoch the fumade steel represented progress. A sudden light made them blink. Gavroche had just managed to ignite one of those bits of cord dipped in resin which are called cellar rats. The cellar rat, which emitted more smoke than light, rendered the interior of the elephant confusedly visible. Gavroche's two guests glanced about them, and the sensation which they experienced was something like that which one would feel if shut up in the great tun of Heidelberg. Or, better still, like what Jonah must have felt in the biblical belly of